Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, with new ways to think about your life through goals, momentum in the real estate market, then learn about various mortgage loan types, conventional, DSCR, fix and flip, bridge loans, short-term rental loans, and more. Knowing which loans to use can save you millions, and learn the fatal mortgage mistakes you must avoid today on Get Rich Education.
Since 2014, the powerful Get Rich Education podcast has created more passive income for people than nearly any other show in the world. This show teaches you how to earn strong returns from passive real estate investing in the best markets without losing your time being a flipper or landlord. Show host Keith Weinhold writes for both Forbes and Rich Dad Advisors and delivers a new show every week. Since 2014, there's been millions of listener downloads in 188 world nations. He has A-list show guests include top-selling personal finance author Robert Kiyosaki. Get Rich Education can be heard on every podcast platform, plus it has its own dedicated Apple and Android listener phone apps. Build wealth on the go with the Get Rich Education podcast. Sign up now for the Get Rich Education podcast or visit GetRichEducation.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Winnebago, Minnesota to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold, and you are listening to Get Rich Education, the voice of real estate investing since 2014. Before we get into the mortgage discussion, where we'll discuss 5 or 10 different investor loan types and their various pros and cons, which could save you millions over the course of your life, I shared with you that I traveled to Colorado a couple weeks ago for a goals retreat hosted by the Real Estate Guys. Top-notch event. I spent extra time there in Colorado Springs because I find it really livable, and I spent 5 hours with a local realtor there one day, out and about, visiting properties in the area. I'm potentially looking for a home or a second home. And by the way, how is this for a price range? The realtor wanted to know what my buy box is. And since I'm just learning the Colorado Springs market, I told him I'm willing to spend between $400K and $1.2 million on the property. Yeah, pretty wide range, a mile wide. Fortunately, my other buy box criteria are more narrow and specific, and I've got to say, I'm surprised at how low the area's home prices are. I thought they'd be higher. Interestingly, before touring homes, my buyer agent wanted me to sign a 6-month exclusive representation agreement. Fair enough, that's standard stuff. It was on the agreement, though, that I, as the buyer, pay a 3% commission upon the purchase, and the seller would presumably pay the other 3% to make up that total 6% commission for the agent compensation. Well, historically, the seller paid the entire 6%, and this, of course, goes back to the NAR settlement and that ruling that became effective in August of 2024. You probably remember this, and I talked about it on the show back then and how it's not really that big of a deal, especially to investors like us. Because at GRE Marketplace and with our GRE investment coaching, it's a direct model. There's zero commission on either side, and then you, in turn, get some of those savings. But out in the larger world and in the owner-occupant world, well, that rule change that started 1.5 years ago, it means that sellers are no longer required to pay the buyer's agent. Instead, the fee is now negotiable between buyers and their agent. The other change is that property listings no longer display the buyer agent's commission offer. But here's what's interesting. In practice, and what really ends up happening in the end, in most cases, is that the seller still pays the full commission and compensates both agents that full 6%. Sometimes it's 5% instead of 6%. Buyers and buyer agents, they still operate under the seller pays, and that's largely because that has just been the norm. It's what's seemingly always been done. It's what buyers are used to. And the reason that often persists is because The seller is the party in the transaction that has that thick equity in the property, deep equity. And buyers are the ones often just trying to scrape together whatever they can for a down payment and closing costs. Buyers are not going to be able to come up with another $15K for an agent commission when they're buying a $500K property. That's 3%. Especially today, this is true because American homeowners, the seller then, still have record equity positions of about $300K, an all-time high. Nearly half of mortgaged homes are considered equity rich. What does equity rich mean? It means that the loan balance is less than half of the home's value. Yeah, the seller has the means to pay the full commission. So the point is, in practice, the seller, still pays that full 5 to 6% commission in the overwhelming majority of cases, and the buyer pays nothing. And if that does change, it's going to take a long time. You know, a lot of these evanescent real estate stories that people think are going to have some seismic impact, it rarely does. Like this erstwhile NAR ruling, or the 50-year mortgage proposal, or banning big institutions from buying more single-family rentals. You know, this stuff is like one little baseball-sized asteroid striking an entire planet. I mean, it's like a barely discernible impact. Real estate is anchored in one place like Jabba the Hutt. It is solid. These stories are interesting, but they're not impactful. Instead, I've mentioned it before, what are 3 things you control in real estate that really matter? And these are evergreen things. First, it's how many dollars are you leveraging? That's where your wealth is going to come from. In fact, we're going to discuss that today with mortgage loan types. Second, what's the efficiency of operations on your existing properties? And thirdly, what is the quality of your relationships? And actually, we're addressing that third one today too, talking to a lender that you could make part of your team. You can control these 3 things. They're unyielding, they're evergreen, they're long-term, and they all have gravitas and impact. Those 3 things: leverage, operations, and relationships. Now, my agent drops me off and picks me up from my hotel here at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs. This was also the event hotel for the Goals Retreat. I just extended my stay to hang out in the area, look at real estate, do some climbing on Pikes Peak. Pro tip for you on hotel room rates: talk to a human being. Before I booked my stay, I called the front desk and asked them if they could extend the attractive event room rate to more nights on my extended stay, and they agreed. You might have heard of the Broadmoor. It is well known. It's been here for more than 100 years, and it is such a fine place to stay. Let me tell you about this special piece of real estate. In fact, I've thought it through, and I will now hereby proclaim that it is the finest U.S. hotel experience that I've ever had in my life. I say U.S. because I stayed at an amazing place in Dubai. But what makes the Broadmoor stand alone? It's the details and the service. A lot of hotels are nice, but this is on a different level. And I don't say this to brag. And this is because you probably can afford to stay here. Yeah, like I have, you might have paid more elsewhere in your life for a lesser hotel, although I am here in the low season. Okay, now, sure, you've got views of the Rockies and a man-made lake and waterfall and even a beautiful chandelier in my hotel room. The thing that sets it apart, though, is you have this service that feels old world and not corporate. That's what makes the difference. The Broadmoor is horse-themed. Since horses are a symbol of the American West, there are about 800 rooms here. It's kind of like a self-contained adult Disneyland. Championship golf courses, a world-class spa, even an outdoor lap swimming pool, like it has lanes that I swam in one morning, fine dining, casual dining, access to hiking, fly fishing, even falconry, zip lines, tennis, pickleball, pools. Take the cog railway to the Pikes Peak summit. Okay, now, other nice hotels have attractions that are sort of like that, but when I rave about the service, it's the little things. They are knocking on my door before 10 a.m. to come in and clean the room. And you know how, so commonly, when you first check into your hotel room and you look in the closet, there are not enough clothing hangers, and they're all, like, stupidly mismatched. These all match, they're all nice wood, and there are plenty of them. So I'm talking about these details. I'm telling you, I had dinner at one of the Broadmoor's restaurants the other night. I just happened to take a close look at the tag on the napkin. Sure enough, it is made in Italy. I mean, geez, no detail is overlooked at this stellar place. In fact, here's what I'll do. I'll just completely stop my Colorado Springs home search right now. Instead, I'm going to stop down by the Broadmoor front desk, tell them to give me some moving boxes because I'm moving into the Broadmoor and I'll be here for the next decade. Start forwarding my mail here and everything. And hey, at least I was courteous enough to give them notice. I can't stay here too long, or my standards will be rising faster than my net worth. Yeah, you can't go to sleep with a mint on your pillow every night, I suppose. Now, the reason I came here now is to attend that aforementioned goals retreat. And let me take all the time and all the resources that I put into being here and distill them into just a few of the most salient takeaways for you. Goals should be smart, strategic, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-based. They must be written down. Now, how would you describe yourself to somebody else that didn't know who you were? Write that down. Next, what do you think your reputation is? How would others describe you? Write that down. Now that you can see how you describe yourself and how others describe you, you can see that there's a gap there. That gap is what you need to work on. I learned that goals should be written in the present tense, not the future tense. I did not know that before. For example, say it is January 1st, 2035, and I own $5 million in rental property. That's an example of how you would do that. So take future events and write them in the present tense. Other questions at the goals retreat that got really introspective are, what are you really going to do with your life? And write down that answer. Sheesh, that is tough. And if you think that's a hard question for you to ask of yourself, the next one is even harder. It's simply, why? Why is that where you're going with your life? And then write that down. I mean, when you answer questions like this for yourself and you really think about it, that can occupy a new segment of your entire headspace. It is a big cognitive load. And a last one to leave you with is to dream not just big, but gigantic. Get it out there. Write down a dream that interests you, but it's so grandiose that you're actually embarrassed to tell someone about this stretch dream. For example, for me, it's the first person to walk on another planet. No human has ever done that. And this would most likely happen on Mars. See, this is so grand that it's sort of embarrassing for me to even share that with you. It almost makes you sound loony, like I would have to learn so many new skills to travel to and walk on Mars. But you should write down a bunch of other goals too. You're sort of brainstorming on goals, attainable goals. Recall, that is the A in the SMART goals acronym. You want to write down a bunch of attainable ones, not just that stretch one. So for attainable ones, one of them is for me to become the highest man on earth, to give you an example. And I attempted that goal 2 years ago, and I failed. I told you about that at that time. But see, now, compared to my embarrassing stretch goal of walking on Mars, the highest man on earth feels attainable. I know what it takes to achieve it, and it's worth doing. But it's a grind to get there, yet it would be worth it. Those are some quick takeaways from the Real Estate Guys Goals Retreat. While on stage, the event host, Robert Helms, he took a minute respite from the goals material, and he recognized the fact that, as he calls it, the 4 OG real estate podcasters are all in the same room. One of them is Helms himself, and now I feel like the other 3 are all older and doing it longer than me. I was one of the 4 that he mentioned. But there is only one podcast that was mentioned from stage, and that is that Robert Helms told the audience that they should be listening to the Get Rich Education podcast. That was a nice thing to say, and he is always a gracious giver. Next, we're talking about 4 major loan types: conventional, DSCR, fix and flip, and then bridge loans. When we discussed the first 2, parts of it could sound repetitive, but you'll see why we do this, because then you'll be able to compare it to niche loan types that we discuss. For example, the speed of a bridge loan, where you can get funded in just 1 week compared to a slower conventional loan. The mortgage landscape changes. I still remember how in 2012, we had still somewhat freshly emerged from the global financial crisis. And back then, you could only get 4 conventional loans for rental properties, not 10 like you can today, 20 married. So get your loans while you can. You probably won't always be able to get 10 loans. We'll start with loan types that are more for beginners, and then we'll get to advanced material. Let's welcome back one of our favorite recurring guests. You can make millions more throughout your life by understanding mortgage loans. This is key. And today, it's the return of the woman that's created more financial freedom through real estate than any other lender in the entire nation, because she's the president of Ridge Lending Group. Hey, it's time for a big welcome back to the incomparable, yet somehow still so approachable, Caeli Ridge.
Mike Keith, thank you for having me. I love being here. I love what you're doing. It's my pleasure, sir.
And our followers, our listeners, have been approaching you since 2015. You're one of the longest running guests, truly one of the OGs around here at GRE. And now, Caeli, before we discuss loan types, we don't really talk politics on this show, rather policies. And we're in the midst of a presidential administration that often, in the name of the word affordability, is trying to supremely shake things up in the housing market. Help us dissect what matters and what won't.
I have found that, at least as it relates to current administration, whoever that might be, I wait for the buzzwords or the taglines to become the actual policy, like you said. That's a good point. In this case, you've got things floating around like the 50-year mortgage, cutting off the hedge fund guys and that kind of thing. Whether or not those things come to fruition, I'm happy to give my opinion on them. I do not think that it's going to move the needle much for the people that you and I serve with regard to, just taking them one at a time. I don't think that the 50-year is going to come to fruition just first and foremost. If it did, do I think it would be a good idea? For a homeowner, probably not. But for an investor, maybe, if there's some way that we can keep our payment lower, given the maturity date of a mortgage for an investment property is usually about 5 years. I know that this is a 30-year fixed mortgage, but statistically speaking, the average shelf life of a non-owner occupied mortgage is about 5 years. So getting a 50-year amortization, if that were going to reduce the payment, I don't think is a bad thing for an investor. However, and this may get a little bit technical for the listeners, so I apologize in advance, if we were to go to a 50-year AM, the adjustments, something called, and you and I have talked about this before, something called an LLPA, that stands for Loan Level Price Adjustment, I think would be such that it could end up defeating the purpose of having the longer term amortization, because I think the interest rates would be higher and I think they may offset. So that was a long way to say, one, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's actually going to get to its final resting place. And two, would it be a good idea for investors? Yeah, I think it would be worth considering if it kept the payment lower. Okay, that's that. as the other piece to cutting off the hedge funds, the big, BlackRock, some of the big players, and giving them access to the residential housing and first right of refusal, or et cetera, because they've got such deep pockets. It's such a small amount to what our individual investors are going to have access to that I don't think that moves the needle either. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, except to say anything that they're going to tout, I would wait for it to actually become written in stone and passed by the rest of the powers that be before I would get excited about or concerned about any of it.
This is pretty parallel with what I've been telling our listeners. All these things seem to make splashy news, but I haven't seen anything that's going to make a deep impact yet, whether it's the 50-year mortgage, which probably won't even come to fruition, or if it's doing these mortgage bond buy downs in order to bring more liquidity into the market and bring rates down, or if it's any of these other things being discussed with these institutional investors, since they already own such a smaller proportion of the housing market than a lot of people think. We'll discuss seasoned real estate investors and their loans shortly, but first, for newer real estate investors, Caeli, I kind of think of 4 or more loan types that a beginner should be familiar with. I think of conventional loans, DSCRs, fix and flips, and then bridge loans. The first one with conventional loans, what are the basics that someone should know?
So first of all, you should know that there are 10 of these. We call them the golden tickets. I'm pretty sure I coined this, 100 years ago. The golden ticket, we call the conventional, aka Fannie Freddie, aka agency. They go by different names, but they all mean the same thing. We call them the golden tickets because it's the highest leverage and typically at the lowest interest rate you can find. Now, I do have a hook in our conversation today about that. We'll get to it. There are 10 of these per qualified individual. So one of the first things that I would tell somebody is that if they are a partnership or a husband and wife team, you want to make sure to keep the debt obligations separate. Because if you want to maximize these golden tickets, let's just say it's a husband and wife team, you each have, per qualification, access to 10. And that includes a primary residence. In fact, let me just take a quick second and define what counts in the 10, because some people get this wrong. So the 10 golden tickets are counted by any residential property, single family up to fourplex, that has a loan on it where the loan is in the individual name or personally guaranteed by the individual. That's where people get tied up. So if they went out and got a kind of more of a commercial type loan that was in an LLC name, for example, but they signed a personal guarantee, per Fannie Freddie guidelines, that particular mortgage is going to count against the 10. So those would be some of the first pieces of news or detail I would give them about conventional.
For married couples, don't take ownership in both the husband and wife's name, either the husband or the wife. That way you can get to 20 rather than 10. And yes, you do have to be mindful that your primary residence does count in that 10 or 20, whatever it might be. Anything else quickly with conventional loans, LTVs, so on?
Yeah, LTV can go to 85% loan to value. So you get a little bit extra than you're going to get in some of the other loan product types. It will have PMI, private mortgage insurance. Anything over 80% LTV will always have PMI on a more conforming conventional basis. So keep that in mind. But the factor is pretty low. I would encourage people that are looking to stretch the almighty dollar, do the math. Look at the 85 with PMI against, say, an 80% and see what are you giving up versus what you're getting. And then qualification stuff, you guys, my dumb joke, it's Keith's favorite, I'm sure. Vials of blood and DNA samples are sort of required for the Fannie Freddie loans, so just be prepared to supply or submit us the tax returns and pay stubs and bank statements and all that stuff.
You'll feel like you're getting fingerprinted almost for conventional loan qualification. And the second one that I brought up, DSCR loans, that's short for debt service coverage ratio. And these mortgages are pretty standard for rental properties. They're underwritten based on a property's income potential. So, the way I think of DSCRs, Caeli, from the lender's perspective, is that sustainable cash flow is what matters. The rent has got to support the property's monthly mortgage payments. So will you talk to us more about DSCRs?
Yeah, I love this product. And this is for somebody that either can't fit into the conventional Fannie Freddie box, or maybe they've exhausted their golden tickets and they're graduating and moving on. This is a great option that will reduce the amount of vials of blood and DNA samples that you're going to have to submit. It still provides for a 30-year fixed mortgage. The leverage is roughly the same, 80% in most cases on a purchase. And to your point, the gross income divided by the principal, interest, taxes, insurance, and HOA, if it's applicable, is the simple formula. The easy math that I'll give people just to kind of solidify that math is that if the gross rents were $1,000 a month, and if the PITI was $1,000 a month, when you divide that, your debt service is 1.0. Now, you can go as low, believe it or not, as low as a 0.75 DSCR. They have those available. Be ready for the interest rate to get a little hair on it, okay? It's going to be higher than what the 1.0 and above is going to be, but you can go as low as 0.75. Those are going to be for the investors that have found a property maybe in distress and they cannot show the current market value rent, perhaps, and it's on the low end. So you can still get that done at 0.75. Just be ready for a higher interest rate.
So the DSCR loan, an alternative for you, which might be especially useful, like Caeli touched on, if you've already exhausted your 10 golden ticket Fannie Freddie loans. A DSCR of 1.2, for example, means that your rent income needs to exceed your principal, interest, taxes, and insurance payment by 20% or more. That's what we're talking about here. And then, Caeli, those were more of loans for the buy and hold type of investor. Tell us about fix and flip loans.
Yeah, so these are a shorter term loan that will allow you to include not just the purchase of the property, but also some renovation or rehab money if you need that. And we're going to be looking at an ARV, after repair value. So you've got a purchase price, you've got your renovation or scope of work budget, and then we're looking for an ARV with the ARV to be somewhere around 75%. So what that means, if you've not heard of this before, you're going to take, let's say, $100,000 value. And if we want the ARV to be at 75%, we're going to lend $75,000. Is kind of the mix there. Those are quicker loans. You're going to be paying much higher rates on those, between 9 and 13%, depending on the deal. The points are also going to be a little bit higher, but a great option for that quick turn and burn where your deal has enough skin in it and you can recapture all your capital and make a good, tidy profit on it.
We're talking about basically fixer-upper loans here with Caeli Ridge, the president of Ridge Lending Group. Yes, these are jalopies that rarely qualify for traditional bank financing. And oftentimes when I think about these fix and flip loans, I'm thinking that often there is interest-only flexibility with regard to those higher interest rates that you need to pay. And I think of it as, a shorter term loan that you've got during your renovation period, oftentimes 12 to 18 months. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, 6, 18, even 24 months. And to your point, yes, all of these are going to be interest only. And one of the cool things about these loans is that if there's enough room in the deal, right, based on what you need to borrow and what we think the ARV is expected to be, you don't even actually have to be making those interest payments. You can build it into the final payout when we go to refinance you out of this short-term loan, or you simply sell the property and pay off that loan. So for example, let's say that your interest-only payment is $1,000 a month, okay? And the value of the property is going to be $200,000 and you only took $120,000. Okay, we're going to be well within that 75% ARV. You can build in that $1,000, say for 12 months, there's $12,000, and just add it to the outstanding balance that you started by owing and not have to be making those payments on an ongoing basis. It's not rented, right? So it might be nice to be able to factor that in to the actual payoff when you go to refinance that, if it's a fix and hold, versus go to sell it on a fix and flip.
Now, long term, we know that the big gains for real estate investors really come from that leveraged appreciation, getting that loan. But sometimes there are situations where we might want to act as a cash buyer. And that brings up this fourth of 4 loan types that I brought up, the bridge loan. Short-term loans that can temporarily finance a property purchase while you're waiting for a longer-term loan to come through, the bridge loan. So I think of it as a pretty speedy loan if you sort of want to act like you're an all-cash buyer.
Yeah, I like this. And in many ways, it's similar to a fix and flip. Interest only, obviously, the term is going to be shorter, 6 months, 12 months, up to 24 months. And based on largely relationship, the bridge loan, for the purpose that you described, really comes into play for an investor that we know and we're comfortable with. We can fund those inside a week for somebody that we've done several of these loans for. So for those that need that really quick turn, once you've established yourself as a seasoned, experienced investor in that space, those are pretty slick and easy to get through.
Why would someone use a bridge loan rather than a fix and flip loan?
So if they're in a very competitive market, that might be another option because those are going to be faster. The bridge loan is going to be faster, where they need to say that they're an all-cash buyer and they only need 7 days to close or whatever it is. It depends on the municipality and the state, but what if you're at the courthouse steps and you need cash quickly? Sometimes it needs to be immediate, so that might not be applicable in this case. But if you put the bid in and you win the bid and you've got, 3 days to perform, usually we can get those done. So it's circumstantial. Those would be two variables or two scenarios that would apply to.
The bridge loan gives you the advantage of speed, but that speed can come at a cost.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're going to be paying probably 3 points, maybe 4 points, and it's short-term interest, 13, 14%.
So with these four loan types that we've discussed, conventional, DSCR, fix and flip, and bridge loans, you can kind of see that there is a loan for most every investment scenario, and there's no reason to rely on only one type. A flipper might start with a short-term fix and flip loan or a bridge loan, and then later refinance to a DSCR or a conventional loan. So consider mixing and matching based on your needs. You're listening to Get Rich Education. We're talking with Ridge Lending Group President Caeli Ridge. More when we come back, including steps for more advanced investors. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Mid-South homebuyers, with over 2 decades as the nation's highest-rated turnkey provider, their empathetic property managers use your return on investment as their North Star. It's no wonder smart investors line up to get their completely renovated income properties like it's the newest iPhone. Headquartered in Memphis with their globally attractive cash flows, Mid-South has an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and 4,000 houses renovated. There is zero markup on maintenance, let that sink in, and they average a 98.9% occupancy rate with an industry-leading 3.5-year average renter term. Every home they offer you will have brand new components, a bumper-to-bumper 1-year warranty, new 30-year roofs, and wait for it, a high-quality renter in an astounding price range, $100,000 to $150,000. Get to know Mid-South. Enjoy cash flow from day one at midsouthhomebuyers.com. That's midsouthhomebuyers.com. Most people think they're playing it safe with their liquid money, but they're actually losing. Savings accounts and bonds don't keep up when true inflation eats 6 or 7% of your wealth every single year. I invest my liquidity with FFI, Freedom Family Investments, in their flagship program. Why? Fixed 10 to 12% returns have been predictable and paid quarterly. There's real-world security backed by needs-based real estate like affordable housing, senior living, and healthcare. Ask about the Freedom Flagship Program when you speak to a Freedom coach there. And that's just one part of their family of products. They've got workshops, webinars, and seminars designed to educate you before you invest. Start with as little as $25,000 and finally get your money working as hard as you do. Get started at freedomfamilyinvestments.com/GRE or send a text now. It's 1-937-795-8989. Yep, text their Freedom Coach directly. Again, 1-937-795-8989. The same place where I get my own mortgage loans is where you can get yours, Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They provided our listeners with more loans than anyone because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. Start your pre-qual and even chat with President Caeli Ridge personally. While it's on your mind, start at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is Rich Dad Sales Advisor Blair Singer. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, and above all, don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. Caeli, when we go beyond this beginner stage that we've been discussing, how about for an investor just trying to scale to 10 doors worth of 1 to 4 unit properties? Now, are there any strategies there or more of a loan order that you would recommend in getting up to your first 10?
I think the strategy starts with calling your lender, ideally Ridge Lending Group, and having that deep strategy call, that discovery call, so that we can really understand and plant some seeds that say, okay, Mr. Jones, these are your qualifications today. this is where you want to be in a year or 10 years. These are the steps that are going to be important that we are mindful of and we take to accomplish and reach those milestones. It's really important to have that baseline understanding of what is your debt to income ratio on day one? What are your assets? What is your credit? Where do you want to be in a year or 10 years, right? Do you want 10 properties in a year's time? It's going to be a very different conversation than if you're going to slow roll this and want to establish 10 purchases or 10 investment properties over 10 years. So identifying those details is going to be part one. And then next, in terms of order, I would say largely the higher price point properties. Typically, I would say put those in 1 through 6. And the reason that I'm saying that is that the underwriting guidelines under conventional financing, they will change based on how many finance properties you have. So of all of the inner working guidelines and things that go into securing a conventional mortgage loan, the 3 top most heavily weighted are going to be debt to income ratio, credit score, and assets. Okay. And within each one of those, the marker or the qualification guideline changes as you evolve and acquire more property. So the higher up the ring you go, or the rung that you go to 10, the more restrictive the guidelines are going to be. So I would typically say get the higher price point properties, go into maybe 1 to 4, 1 to 6, if that's part of your strategy and your diversification of portfolio ownership. Then after you've established having 2 or 3 or 4 properties and that higher price point, as it gets harder to qualify, potentially if your debt to income ratio is a little bit tight, you've got the smaller loan sizes that might be less impactful in debt to income ratio. All of this is very subjective to the individual's qualifications and needs, of course, but that might be one rule of thumb that I would take.
Gosh, this is absolute gold in helping you structure the architecture of a growing income property portfolio. And we're coming up on the Super Bowl. And whatever mortgage lender advertises for the Super Bowl or has some big splashy campaign nationally, they are not the ones that are going to have conversations like this for you. They might be fine for buying a primary residence, but this is why you want to have a long-term strategy and work with a lender that's aligned with you on exactly that sort of thing. And Caeli, is there a specific way in which one can avoid hitting the Fannie Freddie loan ceilings too early if you haven't already touched on it?
Yeah, very good question. I think that this is going to come down to a debt to income ratio conversation. It's easy enough to ensure that we contain assets and credit. Those are easier conversations. The debt to income ratio is the piece that's more complicated and can get away from an investor without them even knowing it. You don't know what you don't know, right? So I would say that debt to income ratio and making sure that your lender, again, hopefully Ridge Lending, because we know this like we know our own faces, making sure they know how to structure and provide feedback and consult on that Schedule E. Part of the beauty of real estate investing is the tax deductions, right? Many people get into real estate investing, not for the cash flow, not even for the appreciation, but for that tax strategy because they're high wage earners or whatever it may be, and they're sick of paying X in taxes. So the debt to income ratio is key in scaling and making sure you can continue to qualify for those loans. The conversations that we have with our clients really go deep about where we can maximize our deductions to ensure that we get the tax benefit without precluding our qualification on a conventional underwriting basis in the DTI category.
Now, during my growth as an investor, when I got above 10 doors, one gets above 20 doors, when one gets to 216 doors, I began where I needed to qualify more on a DSCR basis, where the lender is looking at the property's qualification more so than me. So are there any other thoughts with regard to how one can set themselves up for success in really going big and well beyond 10 doors?
Absolutely. So once we've exhausted the Fannie Freddie, and I think one of the real value adds about Ridge is that we are not a one-size-fits-all, and we are extremely holistic versus transactional. So having that first conversation and understanding what those goals are so that we can pivot as we need to, maximize the golden tickets, whether that be 10 to 20, right? If you're in a marriage or a partnership or whatever, and then setting up for the DSCR loans when the time comes and taking advantage of those. There is no limit to how many DSCR loans we can get for one individual. We have yet to find an individual that we've had to say no, and we've done quite a few of the high acquisition investors, so I don't expect that to be an issue. But yeah, I think it's about planting those seeds, creating roadmaps together, and have those smart discovery conversations.
Now, as you grow, one way you might diversify is to have perhaps at least a part of your portfolio in short-term rentals. So when it comes to getting loans for these sort of Airbnb or VRBO type properties, what does one look for there? How much does the landscape change versus the longer-term rentals that we've mostly been talking about here?
Yeah, I think that the differences are going to be about purchase versus refinance. If we're just talking about purchases, let's kind of try to keep it in one lane. If we're talking about purchasing a short-term rental, you may be limited on leverage. You might lose a little bit of leverage, 5%. Let's say you could get to 75%, and maybe on a short term, they're going to back it off to 70% LTV. So there may be reduction in that loan to value. And the way in which we're going to quantify the income is absolutely important to share with your listeners. On a purchase transaction, we have access to things like an appraisal. An appraisal is going to give us some median rental income, whether it be long-term or short-term, that we will use to offset a new mortgage payment if that's needed for the individual's debt-to-income ratio qualification. Now, if they don't need the rental income to qualify, then it's a non-issue. But if they do, like most of us, need that rental income to absorb this new mortgage payment that we are securing for them, how that's going to quantify is important. So if it's not in a short-term rental area, let's just say it's kind of off the beaten path and there may not be enough data points to support the income that you need, it's important to know that up front versus way down the rabbit hole when you paid for appraisals and you're all the way through the transaction and earnest money might be off the table if you had to cancel, that kind of thing. So really important to understand the numbers in advance, I would say, when we talk about short-term rentals and how the income is going to be quantified from an underwriting perspective.
Why does a borrower often need to make a higher down payment on a short-term rental than they do a long-term rental?
I think that in secondary markets, as we talk about mortgage-backed securities and things like that, it's looked at as a higher risk. A short-term rental is going to be a higher risk than just the stable, long-term, long-burn tenant is going to be there, and they've got their lease for a year, 2 years, or whatever at a time. The short-term rental is more volatile, and it's seasonal. It can be, there's all those different factors. So higher risk means more skin in the game for the investor.
That makes a lot of sense. Does that higher risk also translate into a higher mortgage rate for short-term rentals than long-term rentals?
Fannie Freddie versus DSCR, the answer is no. On the Fannie Freddie side, the interest rate's not going to change. On a DSCR loan, yes, it can be slightly higher, usually about a quarter of a percentage point on a short term versus a long term.
Now, are there any particular markets that lenders want to avoid with short-term rental loans?
No. As long as the property is habitable and all the other metrics fit, qualifications and credit and assets and all that stuff, no, there isn't a market that we're going to have any issues with. Now, we do get the notifications for natural disaster areas, and as that relates to the appraisal and things like that, if it's in a natural disaster area or zone, we may have to hold funding until after the disaster is over, and then we can go and take more pictures and make sure it's still standing and there's no major issues. But otherwise, aside from that, as long as it's habitable, no, there is no market restriction.
Yes, with that variability of income for short-term rentals, you can understand how a lender would be more careful in making a loan and would want you, the borrower, to put more skin in the game for a short-term rental. Well, Caeli, overall, what should an investor do in the next 24 hours to make themselves more lendable before contacting someone like you?
I would say the answer is shticky, but call Ridge Lending Group. That's how you're going to make yourself more lendable. And the reason that I can say that is that everybody's qualifications and needs and goals are inherently different. So calling someone that understands this landscape and can navigate the battleship in the creek, like I like to say, that's the visual aid for those of you that need the visual, is the first key. And with that conversation, we're going to be able to identify for you specifically what you would need to do to become more lendable. And it may be nothing.
Well, over there, Caeli, you're growing. You do loans in almost all 50 states. The GRE podcast has more than 5.8 million listener downloads, and you have helped countless GRE listeners acquire smart investor loans for fully a decade now. Just amazing. So talk to us about all of the loan types that you offer investors there at Ridge.
My gosh. Okay. So I think one of the real value adds for us is that we have such a diverse menu of loan products. We touched on a few of them already. So we've got the conventional Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac stuff. We've got our DSCR loans. We have bank statement loans, asset depletion loans. I can touch on those if you want, Keith. We have our short-term bridge, fix and flip. We have our all-in-one, my favorite, first lien HELOC. We have second lien HELOCs. We have commercial loan products, and commercial can apply to residential and commercial property. Cross-collateralization commercial for residential properties. That just means if you're putting 10 single families into one blanket loan, that would be cross-collateralization. Or if you're buying a storage unit, that's straight commercial. And probably even more than that, ground-up construction. There's really not a limit to the loan products that we offer specifically for investors. The only thing we don't have, I would say, in our arsenal is bare land loans. Those are hard to come by.
Right. It sounds like you recommend a call in order to get some of that back and forth to learn how you can best help that investor. But tell us about all the ways that someone can get a hold of you.
Yes, there's a few ways, of course. Our website, ridgelendinggroup.com. You can call us toll-free at 855-747-4343, 855-74-RIDGE, or feel free to email us, info@ridgelendinggroup.com.
And you might get lucky. Hey, spin the wheel. Caeli does get on the phone and talk to individual investors herself, too. So, Caeli, it's been valuable, as always, to cover all these different loan types for beginners and then what one does when they advance beyond that. It's been great having you back on the show.
Thank you, Keith. I appreciate you.
Oh yeah, a lot to learn from Caeli today. You've got mortgage rates 0.75% to 1% lower than they were a year ago at this time. In fact, last month, they ticked below 6% for the first time in years and their lowest level in over 3 years. But when you introduce geopolitical uncertainty, well, that tends to make rates tick up again. Now, just what does happen when you have a lower overall rate trend like we have? Well, in this cycle, it's already spurred an increase in housing sales volume. It surged to 4.35 million in the latest reporting month, and that is the hottest annualized pace in nearly 3 years. Some of the same people who said wait until rates fall, they're about to realize that prices didn't wait. Demand comes back fast, inventory doesn't. If mortgage rates take another leg lower, we could see quite a refinance wave. In balanced markets or in supply-constrained markets, bidding wars could follow. Now, I've shared with you before that I totally do not predict interest rates. I don't know if anyone should. It is a great way to be fantastically wrong and supremely waste a lot of people's time. Instead, I think it's more efficacious for you to be able to interpret the signs that can trigger a further rate drop. Those signs are a weak jobs report. That tends to bring lower rates because the labor market needs the help. So does softening wage growth. GDP below expectations, inflation continuing to cool, or a pickup in U.S. Treasury demand. These are all signs that can lead to even lower rates. In fact, right now, with already lower rates and higher wages, real estate is more affordable than it's been in about 3 years. But overall, longer term, income property still feels somewhat less affordable. It's less affordable than it was in pre-pandemic times. That's for real. For us investors, though, affordability is less about the price of the property. It's about whether the property pays for itself and grows your net worth while inflation does the heavy lifting for you. That's why it still works for us as investors. Higher prices don't kill investors. Inaction during inflation does. You're not so much buying a, say, $350K property, you're controlling it with $70K while your tenant and inflation do the rest. We don't rely on hope or appreciation. We start with inflation, tax benefits, and debt pay down, and then appreciation typically happens too. A lot of times, the question for us goes beyond whether or not a property is affordable. The question is whether owning an investment property is better than inflation compounding against us, which is in investor mindset for this era. Ridge Lending Group President Caeli Ridge is a regular guest here because the mortgage space is so dynamic and things change a lot. For that reason, we expect to have her with us every few months this year. I'll see you next week. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.